Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's long-range forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. This analysis is being provided for perspective only, and any decision made based upon this presentation is the sole responsibility of the person making the decision. Finally, please remember that all long-range weather forecasting is speculative by nature. If there is one weather pattern around the world that I think right now might be the most influential in our markets, it's going to be here. So we're going to start off first in South America before we come back to the United States. Over the next 10 days, our operational models and our ensembles have been picking up on a very similar pattern to what you see here. And that has been right in through this corridor, and again in through here, we're seeing quite a bit of excess precipitation. Now, this is a critical time of year for this, simply because harvest is really active right now, especially in Mato Grosso, Tocantins, Minas Gerais, Goiás, that region, getting that first crop of soybeans out. And we do know that South America, Brazil specifically, is going to go after a lot of corn acres simply due to supportive prices in the country as well as high demand. So this is going to possibly put a bit of a damper or slow down a little bit the harvest of the soybeans, and we're going to watch this carefully over the next 10 days. I can make an argument that if you go anything beyond about 10 days right now and forecasting South America, it's going to be very challenging. And the main reasons for that is when we look at ocean temperatures in through here, along the west coast of South America, and also what's going on with the Madden-Julian Oscillation, we're getting not exactly the strongest signals from that. And as a result, the week 2, week 3 ensemble forecasts right now are suggesting more persistence than any sort of a pattern change. But I'm not fully buying them, so I want to live within a 10-day window here. Now, the rains that we're getting down here in Argentina are incredibly beneficial to the crop that's down there, given its kind of time period here in terms of its maturity. But things are looking very dry down here, Rio Grande do Sul, Paraguay, and Uruguay. That's this section in through here. And we're at a point where we're trying to finish some of the crop in this area. So we are looking at what this precipitation or lack thereof might be doing to the crop. So we just need to keep an eye on this as we move forward here throughout the month of February, because it's going to be very critical here for the harvest of one crop and the planting of the safrinha crops, both cotton and corn, quite critical at this point. So let's keep an eye on it together. In the United States, we're getting you the latest here update from NOAA. This is the all hazards weather map. If there's been any change, they've removed the winter storm warnings that were in this corridor here just in the last 20 or 30 minutes here at the end of the day on Wednesday. Still have the winter weather advisories out for a large section of the country here, and the winter storm warnings still on the south side. But overall, if I could just kind of paint over the top of this what's going on, our jet stream is largely split coming into the Intermountain West like this. So we're going to be packing up quite a bit of snow in through here, but still a big void of precipitation in the near term that's going on in California. The subtropical branch meets it here, and that's why we see widespread flood watches out for a huge corridor of the southeast, including some severe weather all the way down to the south. So right in through this area, in through here, major flood threat over the coming days, and it looks as though it's going to persist for much of the month of February. We're going to talk about that in a few moments. So I want you to take a look at this flow pattern. We're looking right now, this is today, Wednesday, the flow of the jet stream. Screaming off of Japan, splits here in the Gulf of Alaska, northern branch there, southern branch here. They meet in this deep trough and then race on off to Maine. Now this is practically a carbon copy of spring 2019. And keeping that in the back of your mind, I'm starting to ask questions to myself as to whether or not a February weather pattern like we're seeing now has the ability to persist through the next 3 months. We need to answer that question, okay? So what we're noticing is that through the middle of this month, here are the big changes that we need to pay attention to. We've had over Alaska pretty persistent troughing for a while. I'm going to show you that. But over the last about 6 or 7 days, we've noticed the models have been pushing a ridge into this area. And as a result, the jet stream's coming around like this and going around that ridge, starting off at the base of this trough, and they're meeting for this broader trough that's over the western United States. But over Cuba, the Bahamas, there's been a ridge. And that ridge that's sitting there is forcing the jet stream to run right here from Texas to Maine before then dipping here around this and rising into Europe again. So right now, we've been kind of discussing that in terms of northerly latitude blocking over Alaska and Greenland, it seems as though Alaska's playing with the blocking and Greenland is not. We're going to have a discussion about this because if this pattern here were to continue, this section of the United States would have a very active spring. We would pack up a lot of late season snow in the Intermountain West and parts of the Northwest at California's expense. All California gets out of this are the occasional lows that sneak right down here along the coast, little short waves coming around the broader trough to bring in some precipitation. So when we look out over the next 10 days, just trying to get an idea of this pattern, high pressure cell sitting right off the coast here. It's got systems diverted around it. I just can keep drawing this same pattern. And the major concern in terms of flooding threat is going to be here in parts of the Mid-South and the Southeast. And what's going to keep maybe coastal Carolinas, maybe Florida, southeastern Georgia drier is the fact that we do have that ridge sitting in this area that's going to be pushing these systems a little bit farther to the north. But this is one that has a wide open Gulf of Mexico moisture transport and looks very, very wet in this corridor. Also, just notice with the activity we're going to get out of that trough in this area, systems will be pushing through the center part of the United States, and we're looking at a wetter bias there as well. And like I said, that snow is going to really pack up in the mountains, and we're going to discuss that too. If we stretch this out, I've seen pretty consistent behavior in the European weeklies. It is not as though the European weeklies are always just a perfect representation of the next, 45 days of weather, but this goes from February 15th through March 15th, that month, February 15th to March 15th, and we see the same features showing up. So the jet stream again, dipping into the trough, cooling things off in the west. This is going to be critical for piling up snow, and it seems to just run out of there just like this, and the main storm track is along that strong temperature gradient. So above average temperatures in parts of the southeast, much below average temperatures in the central and western part of the United States, and so the country seems to be split as we push a ridge into Alaska, dislodging that cold air and sending it in this direction. What's preventing the southeast from getting cold is that we're not also ridging out over Greenland. If that were to happen, that would finally change the behavior of the North Atlantic and send that cold air in this direction as well, but we're not seeing that right now. So when I saw that map, it reminded me of February a year ago. So look at the two maps here. These were the February precipitation ranks by division on the left, and the temperature ranks. I just grabbed minimums here, but it's the same idea over there on the right. We noticed that this sector was extremely wet, but so was the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes and the western part of the United States. Temperature-wise, it almost looks identical to what I just showed you. The cold was here and storm track there, and that ridge that was over, the Bahamas and Cuba was a little bit farther to the north here and sat right in this area. And that particular pattern persisted for quite some time. So there is a bit of a difference, though, between this year and a year ago. A year ago, remember, we were dealing with the massive disruption in the polar stratospheric vortex. Happened back in January, but persisted through the month of February, changing our global patterns, our patterns in North America, I should say. Our global wind anomalies are positive right now, but they're decreasing. A year ago, they were increasing throughout the month of February rather than decreasing. So the point here is to say this is kind of a nuanced forecast. There are some things that are lining up and other things that are not lining up with some of our recent, more chaotic springs, like spring 2019. So I'm going to address three questions in this video, okay? We're going to go from west to east. I want to talk about California first, and does it stay dry? I want to move to the Midwest, and I want to be talking about if the persistence forecast is going to be the best forecast moving forward. And then I want to talk about some summer heat and drought thoughts again for not only the Midwest, but the Southeast as well. Starting in California, look at the map over here on the bottom left. Looking at the last 60 days, percent of normal precipitation. We see where it's been wet, much wetter than average in some locations. But California has been much, much drier than normal. And this is what it's done. The Sierra Nevada mountains right now are sitting anywhere between 50 and 70% of normal on snowpack, while much of the rest of the mountains out west are sitting at average or above average. Now, there's been some great research done about this, and I want to put a bug in your ear for later in this video when I talk about that snowpack in the Intermountain West. You see, if we end up finishing the year with a lot of snow here, that tends to give us some sensible cooling in this area in spring and also increases the albedo in this area in spring. Now, what does that mean? That tends to mean that the western United States hangs on to a cooler bias and therefore maybe prefers more troughing in the flow of the jet stream over that area as we start spring. And I'm going to come back to what that means in just a few moments. But California right now, I showed this in my regional western video that came out on Tuesday morning. This was just a snapshot 2 days ago of what snow cover looks like out west. So this, again, just 2 days ago. This is what things looked like a year ago, though. So back in February 2019, much more snow in the Sierra Nevada compared to now. So this is now. This is 1 year ago. So right now, at about 60% of their normal snowpack, California needs to get some strong atmospheric river events. That's where the flow comes right out of the southwest and just comes careening into these mountains from this direction to pile up the precipitation and the snow. So we have to ask ourselves, is that going to happen? Well, notice this. I went back and reconstructed the weather patterns, looking at troughs and ridges, so far since the first of the year. And we've noticed the main trough has been sitting here with a ridge. I'll put an H in it right there. What we've been getting then is the flows going around this and targeting the Pacific Northwest, not California. And that's because, let me just take you from 500 millibars, halfway up in the atmosphere, down to the surface. We keep seeing this area of higher atmospheric pressure sitting here, while all of the lows, see the blue right there? All the lows run the periphery into British Columbia and then down into the Pacific Northwest and into the mountains, hence the greater snowpack. So that's how the pattern has been. Now what I did here was I reconstructed all of the driest Februaries on record only for California. And what did they feature? Over the Aleutian Islands and the parts of the Bering Sea right here, a trough. Over the Hudson Bay, a trough, and a big ridge sitting just off the coast. So that meant the flow was doing this. And that targeted much of the moisture to Alaska, British Columbia, and it avoided the California coast. Why I show you that is because if we look at what the winds were doing, they were anomalously circulating in a pattern like this, just going around and around and around. California doesn't need that. Do you see how the winds are going in that direction right here? What it would need to be, so remember, these are these dry Februaries. We actually need to flip this entire circulation around, sending the moisture from Hawaii straight into the coast. And so these dry years have the exact opposite. Here's another thing they shared in common. So these were the dry years again. We noticed that when looking at the speed of the west to east winds, we call those zonal winds, they're coming off of Africa into this part of Europe fast. Coming off of Japan into Alaska fast. Coming off of, well, south of Hawaii toward Maine fast. What do we have in the forecast for the next 10 days? Very similar pattern. And that split right here is evident right there as well. And this would suggest that for California's forecast for the rest of February into March, the pattern must change over what it is now in order to get us there. We need to can these fast winds coming over the eastern part of the United States and get rid of the fast winds that are coming off of Japan. If those two things change, the split will change and California could go back over into a pattern that's wet. But we are running out of time to build up that snowpack, and that's a big part of this story. Let me add another couple of pieces to the puzzle here. What about the tropics? Well, the Mad-Julian Oscillation has been stuck in null phase. It's going to come out in phase 5 or 6. That favors warmth out east in the eastern part of the United States and really favors a deeper trough in the west, but not in the Gulf of Alaska where we need it. The East Pacific Oscillation has gone from a positive phase over toward a negative phase, which means we're building a ridge into Alaska and the Gulf of Alaska, not a trough, which is what we need. And the North Atlantic isn't helping anything out at all. Staying in the positive phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation means we're ridging out Greenland rather than putting a trough there like we just saw. So we have additive things here pointing toward at least the next 15 days, maybe longer, that California still avoids the precipitation that they need. If there's something that could change, I do want you to notice the figure in the background. Since the beginning of January, the global winds have really cranked up, reaching a peak a couple of weeks ago. They then maintained that peak, but have recently been calming down a little bit. That's going to be important because if we calm down the global winds, that allows for the jet stream to become a bit more wavy, rather than so zonal like you saw me present a moment ago. Let's watch that change to see if it continues on the downward trend, or does it flatten out somewhere in here? That's going to be the big unknown moving beyond the next 15 days or so. What's the polar vortex doing? Well, it's kind of disrupted right now. But what you notice is, over the next 5 days, it seems to regain strength, and by day 10, it's sitting and spinning very nicely right over the North Pole. So the polar vortex keeps getting pushed and prodded, but it never fully disrupts and then connects between the stratosphere, where it lives, and the jet stream down in the troposphere. And we're running out of time. The polar vortex just re-strengthened to here. And we are looking at its overall strength waning normally as we go out into the months of March and April. In other words, to get a disruption in the polar vortex that could then send the remainder of winter into bitterly cold conditions for much of the United States, especially the eastern half, this would have had to have been disrupted more than a month ago. That's my main point about the polar vortex. Translation, if you're in the eastern third of the United States, probability of getting long duration, much below average temperatures is very low. So let's just keep moving that direction. I take you back to this same map. Remember, this flow pattern is 2019 on repeat, spring 2019 on repeat. And my second question is it going to continue to last? Now, as I've been making a case, watch Alaska and watch Greenland. They seem to be the bellwether of change when all these different teleconnections are coming together to make change. Because if the trough sits here and the ridge is over the Bahamas, right in through this area, extremely wet conditions are going to persist. Now, the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is the piece that's missing. Remember, I told you that Greenland, having troughs in this area, this is the part that's not getting blocked up to get rid of the ridging over the southeast. So you've noticed that the North Atlantic Oscillation, the times that it was negative, back in October, back in mid-November, those were our time periods so far in the eastern part of the United States and in the central United States where it got cold and stayed cold. It has stayed above average. Look at this. It has just stayed above average for so long, and the forecast through at least the next 15 days doesn't send it down like this, which means Greenland is resisting the big block of high pressure, and it stays instead with troughs sweeping through it. So what I did next was I said, all right, since we're thinking about the Midwest and we're thinking about spring, I grabbed the wettest March through May springs. And what did they give us? A ridge here in Alaska, Gulf of Alaska, a deep trough out west, and a ridge that extended somewhere here from the southeast to the northeast. Now you all know what's going to happen here. If the flow pattern does this, the section that's going to be soaked here, well, this is for the primary corn belt, it's going to be very, very wet. And it's also going to be cold in the north central plains as we move into spring. So this is a pattern that many of us don't want to see on repeat. But those are the years down there at the bottom that it happened. So what did we end up getting? Well, this is what the mean flow did. It tended to, well, watch it here, ridge into Alaska, deep trough here, racing on off to the northeast. That opened the Gulf of Mexico for flow and just provided all the moisture we need for the repeated rainfall events. That is almost a carbon copy of what we've got going on in the atmosphere now in February. But speaking of that, do we need to be looking at other factors about spring that help us kind of clue in on whether or not it could be wet or dry for the midsection of the country? So I just looked at the primary corn and soybean belt data from NOAA. We know that going back to 1948 to 2019, so that's a 71-year time span, that overall we've added about 2 inches of rainfall. Now if I just block this off, let's just get rid of this, don't look back here and look recently. There have been very few years in the last, well, going back to like 1988, that we've been near or below normal. Many years here have been very wet in spring, including 2019. So this is just an analysis of the trend. So this is what I did. Now, I wrote up here, be careful with this. I'm going to explain why in a moment. We know that by mid-February, we see split flow in the west, with ridging here, trough to the south of it, and a deep trough that's anchored right here over between Greenland and the Hudson Bay. The Februaries of the wettest March through May time periods so spring, corn belt, okay, spring for the corn belt. If we just said, well, what did February do before the wettest springs in the corn belt? Well, we had a ridge here, and that let a trough come into this area, and some ridging that happened right over here, keeping the eastern half of the country warm. Now, many of you are going to look at this and go, holy cow, he's just told me that February now looks exactly like the Februaries did for the wettest springs on record for the Midwest and the Corn Belt. We need to make sure that we take that analysis with a pretty big grain of salt. And why I'm saying that is, I went and grabbed the driest Februaries on record, and look at this. There was also a ridge, a little bit weaker, sitting over a trough where we've got that. See that? The big difference maker was right here. Greenland ridged during Februaries that were really, really dry for March through May. So, when you do this, I want everybody to remember one very simple thing. You cannot take the weather patterns of one month and then assume what the subsequent months are going to be like because of it. But we can start to draw correlations when incorporating several years into a forecast. And what I'm telling you right now is it seems to be coincidental that the pattern establishing itself right now in February is lining up with a very wet spring for the midsection of the country. I think we have to wait until we get into the March weather patterns before we ever know what April and May are going to look like, at least a shot at what they're going to look like. I also did this. I said, well, what about the driest Marches through May? What did the jet stream do during March through May? We come right back to the same story. Troughing over Alaska. Alaska's that bellwether. You see, if you get a trough over Alaska, the jet stream does this and then runs up into a ridge over Montana before diving back into a trough here. We get a lot of upper level convergence in that area, and as a result, a drier pattern in the midsection of the United States. What may help this along is the fact that over the last, well, maybe 2 months, the sea ice extent, which we were worried about in fall, filled in and is roughly normal in content now. And if that sea ice remains in this area to be as extensive as it is, that could at least help Alaska with troughing once we get into March, April, and May. Now, if Alaska gets into a trough in March, April, and May, that would signal a drier time period for the Midwest to do their planting. From there, let's now talk about the bigger picture and answer some questions about El Nino. I've been getting asked a lot of great questions about El Nino, and right in through this area is where we watch for it. Now, if the temperatures inside that oval I just drew were much above average, in other words, warm and warm colored, we would be talking about El Nino. If they were all cool, we'd be talking about La Nina. Right now, we really don't have either. We could call this ENSO neutral. We could call this a Mordecai El Nino, where it's warm here and cool there. But in reality, it's all about how the atmosphere responds. The Southern Oscillation Index, SOI, it's near zero now. It's been increasing, moving away from what we would have called weak El Nino conditions recently to now being just normal trade winds. We've slowed down our westerly wind bursts, and the Madden-Julian Oscillation went over to the null phase and is really not a major factor. So I'm just going to tell you this. If we have, going into spring, the atmosphere behaving like there's a bit of an El Nino, it is positively correlated with wet conditions all through here. But right now we don't have that, okay? Which means El Nino is almost off the table as a major function of our spring weather. That's why I've been focusing so much on Alaska. So, I also want to discuss that longer term drought, my third question. I want everybody that watches my content to keep a close eye on the ocean temperatures inside of the area that I'm kind of highlighting right here. We can see that over the last few months we've had some cooling along the west coast, both of North America and South America. And if this region in through here starts to cool as well, that could actually be something that might start to get us thinking more about the chances of this upcoming summer having some heat in the Midwest, and this also influences the position and strength of the ridge over the southeast. And so my main comments at the end of this video is, I am very unclear of how February's weather patterns will transition into March. I do not know. I am trying to draw correlations, but my confidence is extremely low. I want to know what's going to happen over Alaska and over Cuba and the Bahamas. The position of that ridge down there is going to be critical. So please don't leave this video thinking that I've just told you that whatever's happening in February is going to match what happens in March, April, and May. It's not. But we needed to see those correlations to build this weather story out. We need to get past what's called the spring barrier. I need to get to where we're accumulating the heat again, shifting the intertropical convergence zone, the ITCZ, getting it north, and watching the jet stream respond to that before I can ever make a call on what spring's going to do. If there is one thing that is in the opposite phase from a year ago, it's this thing called the quasi-biennial oscillation. It's the winds in the upper levels of the troposphere and the base of the stratosphere around the equator. A year ago, last spring, starting right now, the QBO was increasing in strength every month from winter through early summer. It's actually right now decreasing in strength. So what I'm trying to tell you is, for all of us attempting to make a forecast for spring and trying to understand what's going to happen right now, making one at the beginning of February doesn't quite yet have all the pieces lined up in place to give us a solid picture. Yes, there are risks for the midsection of the country to be wet, the West Coast, especially California, to be dry, and the Southeast to be both wet and warm. But those particular pieces that are lining up now may not be there by the time we begin the month of April. So we'll watch it, report back to you every week like we normally do, and I hope that you found some insight in this, but at the same time understood how nuanced of a forecast we're putting together right now. But that's what we've got. We'll wrap it up right here. Thank you for your patience today with this video. I look forward to talking again tomorrow morning. Have a good one.